In this short video, I'm going to talk about capacity planning for speed tests. My name is Dan Siemon, CPO and co-founder of Preseem. I'm going to talk about a very simple model here that has three main components. It has capacity, headroom, and then a number of subscribers at a typical bandwidth. And we're going to talk about each of those three components and then do a short concrete example based on that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the subscribers at typical bandwidth. You can see in this example, there's 6 bars there. Those represent the 6 subscribers that we're going to carry through this entire example. So what is typical subscriber usage? Well, this is the amount of bandwidth that you can kind of plan that a subscriber is going to use in your network during peak time. We've reported on this for a little while in our fixed wireless report. Last edition, it showed at about 6 megabits per second, which is up 17% year on year. This is something that grows kind of every year, whether you want to it or not. And if you're rolling out fiber or Tirana or bigger plans, you can expect it to grow even a little bit faster than this. But what's interesting here is the bandwidth consumed by users does not grow nearly as fast as the plan speed. Concretely, an example of that is if you sell a 50 megabit per second plan, the customers do not use double a 25 megabits plan. In fact, it's much, much flatter than that. You can see in this chart, again, from our fixed wireless report, that grows very slowly between very small plans up to about 100 megabit per second. You can pretty much use a number of 5 megabits per second as the value for typical subscriber usage. Again, it's very interesting that it doesn't grow fast. Even if you go up into 250 meg plans and beyond, the slope is probably a lot less steep than you might otherwise expect. Now let's move on to talking a little bit about capacity. If you're talking about a fiber, that's very easy to understand its capacity. Thinking about a backhaul with good signals and a pretty constant modulation, that's pretty easy to do understand the capacity. It's of course a lot more complicated in a multi-point wireless environment, which we'll focus on in the next couple slides. The real world performance for access points varies quite a bit from the spec sheets, or maybe we'll just say the idealistic case that's sometimes published on the spec sheets. We have had in our fixed wireless report for a number of years now, representation of what we think is kind of like the realistic best case of a given access point model across all of our customer base. And the number we chose there after looking at the data was the 95th percentile. So basically, this means that 95% of the APs in this given model achieve less throughput than this, 5% achieve more. Of course, there's always a whole bunch that aren't, just been deployed, maybe aren't fully loaded yet. So that's why we can't use the lower percentiles and we focus on the higher percentiles. But nevertheless, we think this represents a pretty good estimate of what you can reasonably expect to find in the field. You'll see there are some examples that are much better, but again, they're going to be in that very top 5%. So to pick on one example here, EMBP 2000, is a simple one because it has a nice round number we can talk about. 95% of the EPMB 2000s that we see across all our customers deliver less than 61 megabits per second of throughput during the busiest minutes of the day. Maybe that's something I should highlight a little bit, that all of the analysis that we do inside of Preseem and in our fixed wireless report is based on the busiest minutes of the day, when the most users are active and the highest bandwidth, not just either one of them, and some other math around that as well. And we do this because it represents essentially kind of like the worst case for the network. And then that is able to drive proactive improvements and other activities, whereas just looking at current values doesn't enable that kind of use case. So during the 10% busiest minutes of the day, 95% of the thousands of EP and P2000s that we see deliver less than 61 megabits. And we're going to use 60 megabits per second because it's a nice round number for the rest of this model. Now let's talk a little bit about headroom. Headroom is obviously the gap in between here, but why is that important? In the previous slide, we said that typical subscriber bandwidth does not go up much with plan rate, and that's good. I mean, you can sell bigger plans. You don't need to, double the plan. You don't need to double your capacity in your network. For speed tests, though, it's a little bit different. The plan rate really drives what the customer expects to see in a speed test. And that really drives the needed headroom calculations. So if you want to deliver a 20 megabit per second speed test on your network to a given customer, there's going to have to be 20 megabits per second of free capacity on that AP. And if not, they either A, won't hit the plan rate, or B, they'll have a negative impact on all the other customers that are on that plan rate. So for example, if a speed test kicks off and takes 80% of the bandwidth on an AP, everyone else's video and games and stuff are going to suffer. So if we look at the complete example here, we've got, again, starting at the bottom, we have 6 subscribers at 5 megabits per second each, typical values. Again, these are kind of the law of large numbers. If you have 1 subscriber on an AP, you can't say much about their throughput. If you've got a large number, it's going to average out to 5 megabits per second. We have 60 megabits capacity, which means we have 30 megabits of headroom in the middle there. This means that this AP, we could do something around 35 megabits per second is the maximum plan we can sell and still deliver the speed test without damaging the experience of the other subscribers. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, those are some nice flat lines. That's not very realistic. And that's absolutely true. For multi-point networks, that orange line is never that flat. And let's talk about why that is. This comes down to basically the effective AP link rate. In Preseem, we have a model of this where we look at who's transmitting, at what modulations, at what times. And with all that combined together, we can build this model of the effective link rate of the AP at a given time. So both of these charts are from the same access point. The one is about 7 days-ish, and the one is about 2 days wide. The one on the right is about 2 days wide. And you can see over the course of the day, the aggregate use effective throughput changes between 60 and 40 megabits per second. And just want to emphasize that this isn't because of environmental conditions or anything like that. This is because during peak, it's more likely that low modulation subscribers are active, and therefore the aggregate effective AP throughput is going to go down during these times. And unfortunately, as we'll see in a second, that's when you need the throughput the most. This is primarily a function of modulations of individual subscribers, that this effective AP rate can change so much over the day. So as just a quick aside, kind of related to this, but not directly, it is really important to have as good a modulations on all your access points as possible. I went hunting, I found an EPMP 2000 with really good RF conditions. Here's 18 subscribers, all with really high modulation. Notice that line, that's up at 200 megabits per second, not the 60 megabits per second that we've seen is effectively kind of the normal best case. So this one here is really far up. This is probably like a 99th or 98th percentile AP. But what's neat here is not only the higher rate, but because it's much more consistent, it is much easier to plan this network, and it is much easier to capacity plan the network, like how much you can sell, and also much easier to guarantee a good experience for the customer, of course, and speed tests figure into that as well. So modulations are really important. I have a couple of resources at the end we can talk about that can help you understand that, if that's something that you're not familiar with. So this is a more realistic picture, right? We've got a capacity line, this orange line, which is shifting through the day. This is point to multi-point. As subscribers, more and more of them become active in the evening, the effective rate drops down. That's that orange dip there in the middle. And then through that same time, that is also the time when the users become the most active. There's more users on and they want to do more stuff. And unfortunately, that creates this narrow waist, which is the most difficult time to be able to hit speed tests. Again, if you think about a customer who runs a speed test during that time, if they're able to take all the bandwidth on the AP, and we're already at the point of day where we have the least amount of headroom, that's going to have the most impact on other subscribers. That's one reason why it's really important to have something managing the traffic that understands the AP capacity, not just individual subscribers. Otherwise, you can't actually modulate the bandwidth in these areas. Now it's time to think a little bit about, like, what does it actually mean to try to hit the plan rate at all times? Even the CAF2 funding, where that's federal dollars, funding broadband buildouts, it has success conditions around hitting 80% of the bandwidth 80% of the time. If I look at this network, just eyeballing these, I think that over 80% of the time, it's quite likely this particular access point is going to have no trouble hitting speed tests. It's really during that peak time where that's going to be most difficult. And ultimately, it becomes a business decision for everybody and every business to think about, well, how much of the day do I need to be able to hit the speed tests? That's ultimately what's going to come down to individual, again, business decisions and capacity on access points as well. We have a couple of free resources on our website. When you go to Preseem.com under resources, there's our RF ebook, which is Preseem's Guide to Capacity Planning in the RF Environment. Lots of interesting information on explaining how modulations work, why it's so important, what it actually means to have a good modulation and not. Hopefully that's useful. And then we also publish our yearly fixed wireless report. That's where I got those numbers of the typical access point capacity. For example, there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. Thanks for your time. Hopefully that was useful. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.